It was the night of December 12th, 2024, and the temperature outside was already plunging into the freezing digits. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered ground. Inside the cramped, somewhat run-down train car, the buzz of conversation and the clattering of metal on metal was the soundtrack to an otherwise ordinary late-night journey. But tonight was not going to be ordinary. In fact, this was going to be a night that would change everything for everyone involved forever. It was exactly 11:32 p.m. when the incident happened. A sudden, heated argument broke out between a black passenger, a man named Marcus Bellamy, and the train conductor, a grizzled, middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a scowl that seemed to be permanently etched on his face. The exchange started with an innocuous request from Marcus. Just a simple question about where his seat was located. But what followed would soon spiral into something that no one could have ever predicted. "Hey, buddy, can you move it? You're standing in my way," the conductor barked, shoving past Marcus as he moved up the aisle. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but curious. "Excuse me, sir, I think I'm just trying to find my seat. Could you help me out?" The conductor sneered. "You should know by now, seat or not, you don't belong here." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp as a knife. Marcus stared at him, a quiet tension building in the small train car. The air was still too still. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something terrible was about to happen. With a sudden jerk of his arm, the conductor reached for Marcus, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him out of the aisle, pushing him forcefully toward the door. The passengers watched in shock, some of them whispering, some just frozen in disbelief. "You need to get off this train," the conductor growled, his voice rising with anger. "Now!" Marcus's eyes narrowed. He didn't move, he didn't have to. The people in the train car couldn't understand it, but Marcus wasn't the kind of man who reacted out of anger. He was far too disciplined for that. The conductor, however, didn't seem to care about the silent power emanating from Marcus. As the conductor's hands gripped tighter, Marcus, without warning, snapped his arm up, catching the conductor's wrist in a hold so precise and swift that the man gasped in pain. "Let go of me," Marcus said, his voice steady calm, yet dangerous. But that wasn't the part that would leave everyone stunned. What happened next left all the passengers in stunned silence. The conductor, desperate and flustered, suddenly opened the door, pushing Marcus out into the icy wind and snowstorm. The train continued to move ahead without even slowing down. It was a freezing, bitter night, the kind of cold that could freeze a person's breath in the air and freeze their skin to the bone in seconds. And Marcus Bellamy, with nothing but the clothes on his back, found himself standing in the middle of the night, the wind howling in his face, while the train sped away into the distance. The conductor slammed the door behind him, unaware that Marcus Bellamy was not just any passenger. The man being thrown into the freezing cold was, in fact, Marcus Bellamy, a former Delta Force commander. But why was he on this train? What was he doing here, so far from the mission that had shaped his entire life? No one could have known the depth of the storm they had just unleashed by tossing a man like him into the cold. Train conductor kicked black passenger off into freezing cold. Unaware, he is a Delta Force commander. Marcus Bellamy stood there for a moment, his mind whirling. Every bone in his body screamed against the cold, but his training kicked in. He knew what to do, how to survive, and what was coming next. The man had underestimated him. The world was about to see what happens when you make a mistake like that. But the question on everyone's mind was, why had he been kicked off? What did he do to deserve this? As Marcus stood in the snow, the wind howling louder now, his breath coming in short, freezing bursts, he thought back to the events that had led up to this moment. Marcus Bellamy had always been the kind of man who kept to himself. Raised in a small town in Georgia, he had learned early on how to handle adversity. But when he had been recruited into the Delta Force, his life had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. The elite training had shaped him into something else, a living weapon. His instincts, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his uncanny way of reading people had earned him respect, not just from his fellow soldiers, but from his enemies, too. After years of secret operations and military missions, Marcus had chosen a quieter life. But life had a way of pulling him back into the fray, and now, Here he was, standing in the middle of nowhere on a freezing night, pushed off a train by a man who had no idea who he was dealing with. The sound of the train's engine faded into the distance. Marcus' mind shifted into tactical mode. But before he could make his move, there was a crackling sound in his earpiece. "Marcus, do you copy?" A voice buzzed through the static. It was his former commanding officer, Captain Jameson. Marcus didn't respond right away. He was still processing the events, still figuring out what his next steps were. But then he spoke, his voice as calm as ever, despite the fact that he was standing in a blizzard in the middle of nowhere. "I copy. What's going on?" "We need you back, Bellamy. There's been a change of plans. Get to the extraction point as soon as you can." Marcus didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The man had been thrown into the cold, but it wasn't just the weather he needed to worry about anymore. A new danger was coming. Would Marcus make it out of this alive? Would he find the answers he was looking for? Or was there more to the story than what he had been told? The night was far from over, and Marcus was just getting started. The wind bit into Marcus's skin, making every breath feel like a frozen needle to his chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't have time for that. His training had taught him to push through pain, through discomfort. The moment he had been thrown out of the train, he'd immediately switched into survival mode. He knew he had only moments before hypothermia would begin to set in, and he needed to move fast. "Focus," he muttered to himself, looking around for any signs of civilization. All he could see was the white expanse of snow and the fading glow of the train's lights as it disappeared into the distance. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small satellite phone. The screen lit up, showing a map of the area and a blinking red dot, his extraction point. It was several miles away, but he knew better than to rely on technology in moments like this. The storm was picking up fast, and the last thing he needed was to waste precious time fiddling with gadgets. As he set off into the snow, his mind raced through every scenario. What the hell had just happened back on that train? Who was that conductor? Why had he acted that way? He had a feeling that the answers weren't going to come easily. But Marcus wasn't a man who needed things to be easy.
His heart pounded as he trekked through the snow, each step a struggle against the cold. He focused on his breathing, deep and steady, focusing on nothing but the task at hand. The first rule of survival in a situation like this was simple: keep moving. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The storm was relentless. Marcus's thoughts wandered as he pushed on, almost as though the cold didn't even exist anymore. His body moved on autopilot, his muscles remembering the long, grueling hours of military training. He'd been through worse than this. Much worse. Still, something gnawed at him: the incident on the train. What had triggered the conductor's attack? Marcus had been on his way to an undisclosed location, blending into the crowd, keeping his head down. He didn't want attention. But someone on that train had noticed him, and it wasn't the conductor who had the issue. No, there was something more to this. The wind screamed in his ears as Marcus finally reached the outskirts of a small town. Through the blinding snow, he could make out the faint silhouette of a rundown gas station. He headed towards it, hoping for shelter, food, or, at the very least, some kind of answer. When he reached the station, he pushed open the door, grateful for the warm air that hit him like a wave. The place was deserted, but the flickering lights and half-stocked shelves told a different story than the one outside. Marcus moved to the counter, scanning for any signs of life. "Hello," he called out, his voice carrying in the empty room. But no one answered. He took a seat on the stool at the counter, pulling his gloves off to rub warmth into his stiff hands. It was then that he noticed the phone on the counter, the old-fashioned kind. There was a small note beside it, scrawled in handwriting that wasn't familiar. "Leave now. You're being watched." Marcus frowned, picking up the note and tucking it into his pocket. Who the hell would be watching him? And why? Before he could think too much on it, the door to the station opened with a creak, and Marcus tensed instinctively, his body prepared for whatever was coming next. A tall figure stepped inside, silhouetted by the snowstorm outside. The man was wearing a heavy coat, his face obscured by the low brim of a hat. He stepped closer, looking around at the shelves as though casually browsing. Marcus's eyes narrowed. There was something about this man. He couldn't place it, but he knew that whoever he wasn't just some average civilian trying to escape the storm. The man looked at Marcus for a brief second before turning his attention to the counter, as if he hadn't even seen him. Marcus wasn't convinced. Keeping his eyes on the man, Marcus slowly slid his hand under his jacket, fingers brushing the cold metal of his knife. He wasn't sure who this man was, but he wasn't taking any chances. The man moved forward, brushing past Marcus. As he did, their eyes met for a brief moment. It was subtle, but Marcus noticed the flicker of recognition in the stranger's eyes. The man stopped. "You're him," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Marcus stiffened. "What did you say?" The man ignored him, taking out a small device from his pocket. "We've been tracking you, Bellamy. You need to come with me." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "Tracking me? For what?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a badge. "We're with the Department of Homeland Security. There's something going on. You're in danger." Before Marcus could respond, the lights above flickered, and a deafening crash from outside shook the building. The sound of tires screeching and engines revving followed. Marcus instinctively moved toward the door, heart racing. What was happening? He glanced back at the man, who seemed unfazed. "You don't have much time," the stranger said, his voice urgent. "You need to come with me, now." Suddenly, the door burst open. Snow and ice whirled into the room, and a group of armed men stormed inside. Their presence was immediate, forceful. They had their guns raised, aimed directly at Marcus. The man with the badge stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward Marcus. "It's too late now, Bellamy. You're not safe. But we can protect you if you trust us." Marcus's mind raced. He didn't trust anyone, especially people who said they were trying to help him when they were actually just making things worse. But one thing was certain. The game had just changed. Now he was the one being hunted. The cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet snow and the tension that was so thick it could suffocate you. Marcus Bellamy's fingers twitched, his hand still near the knife under his jacket. The group of armed men in the doorway didn't flinch. They looked like they were expecting trouble, but not this kind of trouble. The man with the badge, still calm, took a step forward, his voice firm, yet somehow carrying an undertone of urgency. "I don't think you understand, Bellamy. This isn't about you being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is bigger than that. It's about the people who are hunting you." Marcus studied the stranger with the badge, his mind racing. "Who's hunting me?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. He wasn't about to let his guard down, no matter how well this man dressed his words. The man hesitated for a split second. "I can't say too much here. We're being monitored." He paused, glancing over his shoulder at the men behind him. "All I can tell you is that you've become a target. A very important one." "Important?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What, because I was a Delta Force commander?" The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "It's not just your past, Bellamy. It's what you know. And it's what they think you know." Before Marcus could respond, one of the armed men moved toward him, his weapon aimed directly at Marcus's chest.
"Move. Now."
The command was cold, blunt. The barrel of the gun glinted under the dim lights of the station. Marcus's gaze flicked to the weapon, then back to the man with the badge. "So, you're going to take me somewhere. No explanations, no questions?" "We'll explain everything," the man promised, "but we can't afford to wait any longer. They'll be here soon." A crackling sound came from the radio on one of the armed men's vests. "They're closing in," a voice murmured, and a wave of tension passed through the room. Marcus could feel the shift. Time was no longer on his side. He sighed, still not trusting anyone in the room. But there was no time for a standoff. He didn't like the situation he was in, but he wasn't going to get answers by standing here and doing nothing. "Lead the way," Marcus said, his voice steady. The man with the badge nodded, and just like that, Marcus's fate was sealed.
He was in this now.
As he followed them outside, the wind howled louder, as if nature itself was warning him to turn back. But Marcus had never been one to back down from a fight, and this wasn't over yet. The group led him to a black SUV parked at the side of the station, the engine already running. Marcus climbed in, taking a seat across from the man with the badge. The armed men flanked the vehicle, their eyes scanning the surrounding area, clearly on high alert. No one spoke for a few moments, but the tension inside the SUV was palpable. Marcus broke the silence. "You're telling me I'm a target.
But why?
What did I get caught up in?" The man finally turned to him, his face set in grim lines. "It's not about what you've done, Bellamy. It's about what they think you've uncovered. There's something bigger than anyone realizes. And they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays hidden." The SUV rolled through the dark streets, the headlights cutting through the blinding snow. Marcus's mind whirred, trying to process everything. It didn't make sense. He'd been trying to live a quiet life after leaving the military, far away from the kinds of things he used to do. So, why was he suddenly in the middle of something so dangerous? The man continued, his tone lowering. "It all started with a covert mission. A mission you were a part of. But there were complications. Now, those complications are coming to a head, and people in very high places are trying to keep it quiet." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What complications?" "I can't get into the details," the man replied.
Not yet.
"But you'll find out soon enough. The people hunting you, they know your past and they know how valuable you are." The words hung heavy in the air, and Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of them. He had no idea what they were talking about, but if they were right, and something he had done or uncovered had put him in danger, it was only a matter of time before things got worse. And they would. Marcus knew that. The SUV drove through the night, the snowstorm intensifying with each passing minute. The windows were fogged up, and the windshield wipers struggled to clear the accumulation of snow. Despite the chaos outside, the tension inside the car remained thick. No one spoke as they moved farther away from the town. Marcus had been trained to read people, and right now the group was giving off vibes that screamed danger. Finally, the man with the badge spoke again. "We're taking you to a safe house, a location off the grid. You'll be safe there, for now." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew better than to trust anyone who promised safety in a world like this. There were always strings attached. As they pulled up to the safe house, Marcus could see that it was isolated. A small cabin on the outskirts of a thick forest, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. The snow had slowed down a little, but the cold still gripped everything in sight. The man with the badge looked over at Marcus one more time. "This is where it gets real. There are things you need to know, but you're going to have to trust me. It's not safe for you anywhere else. Not anymore." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had no choice but to trust them, at least for now. But he wasn't about to let his guard down. Something told him that the worst was still yet to come. As they got out of the SUV, Marcus's instincts flared. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He was being watched. Someone was out there. Someone dangerous. And they were closer than he thought. The door to the cabin creaked open, and the group ushered Marcus inside, but his mind was already racing. What was going to happen next? Who were these people? And what in the world had he stumbled into? Inside the cabin, the warmth hit Marcus like a wave. The heat from the small wood-burning stove in the corner was a welcome relief from the biting cold that still clung to him, but it didn't ease the tension in the air. Every movement of the men around him felt like a potential threat, and Marcus wasn't about to forget that. He glanced around the dimly lit room, noting the bare walls, the worn-out furniture, and the heavy curtains that shut out the outside world. It was the perfect place to hide, but also the perfect place for something sinister to happen. The man with the badge, still holding his composure, motioned for Marcus to sit at a small wooden table in the middle of the room. One of the armed men, who had introduced himself as Agent Clark earlier, stood by the door, keeping watch. The other took position by a window, peering out into the night. The atmosphere in the cabin was tight, almost suffocating. "We'll explain everything now," the man with the badge said, his eyes steady but filled with urgency. "But you need to understand something first. You're not the only one who's been targeted." Marcus raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "What do you mean, I'm not the only one?" The man sat across from Marcus, leaning forward slightly. "There are others. Others like you, people who've uncovered things that were never meant to be found. You're a part of something bigger than you realize. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Uncovered what? The man hesitated for a moment, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to burst through the door. I can't say too much, not yet, he replied. But I'll give you the basics. You were involved in a mission that had to do with something called the Black Lotus Initiative. It's a covert operation, one that was supposed to stay buried. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Black Lotus, he repeated. He had heard whispers of it, but nothing concrete. No one had ever told him the real story behind it. Yeah, the man continued, his voice low. It's a project that went rogue. A weaponized bioengineering program involving high-level experiments. But something went wrong. People started dying. And not just from the tests, they were killed to keep it quiet. Marcus's mind raced, piecing the fragments of information together. Black Lotus. He remembered the classified briefing he had been a part of years ago, just before he was pulled off the operation. He had never known the full extent of what they were working on, just that it was dangerous, and more than likely, something no one should mess with. But how does this connect to me? Marcus asked, trying to get a clearer picture.
Why am I involved?
The man's expression hardened. You were a part of the cleanup. When the project was compromised, you were sent in to eliminate anyone who might expose it. You thought the job was finished, didn't you? Marcus stayed silent, recalling that mission. It had been one of the most dangerous of his career. His team had been tasked with erasing all evidence of Black Lotus, destroying the files, covering up the bodies, making sure nothing would ever be traced back. It was supposed to be a clean operation. But Marcus remembered the nagging feeling that something had been off. He had never fully trusted that mission. And now it was clear why. So, you're telling me that Black Lotus didn't end after I left? That it's still out there? Marcus asked, his voice growing harder. Exactly, the man said. And now, the people who were behind it are coming after anyone who knows too much. They want to finish what they started. Asterisk, and they'll stop at nothing starred. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin, interrupting the conversation. Marcus's body tensed, his muscles going rigid. Agent Clark moved to the door without hesitation, but Marcus could see the flicker of concern in the man's eyes as he checked through the peephole. The man with the badge stood up, his posture becoming more guarded. It's them, he said grimly, before turning back to Marcus. Get ready. Marcus didn't need any further explanation. He had been through enough life-or-death situations to know when danger was on the doorstep. Agent Clark opened the door slowly, and a cold gust of wind rushed into the cabin, carrying the smell of something off. Standing in the doorway was a man Marcus had never seen before, tall, dressed in tactical gear, and holding a silenced pistol. Behind him, another figure stepped into view. This one was older, with a scar running down his face, his cold eyes scanning the room with precision. The man looked like he had seen the darkest corners of the world. You must be Bellamy, the older man said, his voice low and raspy. I was hoping we'd meet under different circumstances. Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen men like this before. They were the type who thrived in the shadows, the kind who had no problem doing the dirty work for those in power. What do you want? Marcus asked, his tone steely. The man with the scar didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to the soldier with the pistol. We've been following you, Bellamy. We know you were involved with Black Lotus. We know you have answers. And we're not leaving here until we get them. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a threat that was closing in fast. He glanced at the man with the badge, who seemed to be weighing his options. The tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point, and Marcus could feel the walls closing in around him. We need to move, the man with the badge finally said, his voice urgent. They know we're here, and if we don't leave now, we're sitting ducks. Marcus stood up, his body ready for action. He wasn't going down without a fight. He had faced far worse than this in his career. But this wasn't just a fight. This was survival. With his hand on his knife and his mind racing, Marcus knew one thing. If he didn't get out of here and find some answers, things were going to get much worse. Get in the SUV, the man with the badge ordered, his voice low but commanding. The door slammed shut behind them as they made their way out into the night. But Marcus's eyes were already scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. Because he knew one thing for sure: the storm was far from over. The wind howled as Marcus stepped out of the cabin, the icy air cutting through his clothes like shards of glass. The SUV was parked in the same spot, but the tension in the air felt different now. It wasn't just the cold. It was the sense that something was waiting for them, watching, ready to pounce at any given moment. The man with the badge motioned for Marcus to get in first. His eyes darted around, scanning the snow-covered landscape. Agent Clark and the others were already moving to the vehicle, weapons ready. The older man with the scar stayed a few paces behind, his gaze never wavering. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice low, almost drowned out by the wind. The man with the badge didn't answer immediately, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that made Marcus uneasy. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "But we can't stay here." Marcus didn't press him further. The air was thick with the unspoken truth. If they stayed in that cabin, they wouldn't make it out alive. But where were they going? And why were these men so certain they were going to be safe? Marcus didn't trust anyone in this situation, and his gut told him that whatever was coming, it was going to be worse than anything he'd already faced. The SUV's engine roared to life, its headlights slicing through the darkness. As they drove deeper into the forest, Marcus tried to focus, to think, but the weight of the situation made his mind race. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling. Black Lotus, a covert operation he'd been a part of years ago, wasn't just some secret military mission. It was something far darker, something much more dangerous. "Who are these people, really?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror, where the figures of their pursuers were barely visible in the distance. "Enemies," the man with the badge said, his voice hard. "People you don't want to cross. They've got resources. And they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Marcus clenched his fists. He had spent years in the shadows of war, facing enemies that were just as cold and calculating as the ones now hunting him. But he had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The people in the SUV with him weren't allies. They were people who were only using him for something bigger. He didn't need to trust them. He needed answers. As the vehicle sped through the snow-covered road, Marcus's mind continued to race. Why me? Why had he been pulled into this web of lies and danger? The only thing he knew for sure was that Black Lotus was the key to it all. But what was the key to that key? Suddenly, the car jolted, throwing Marcus against his seat. The man with the badge cursed under his breath, grabbing the wheel with both hands as the SUV swerved to the right. Marcus's hand flew to his seatbelt, bracing himself for impact. But the driver regained control just in time. "We're being followed," the man with the badge said, his voice now tense. "Hold on." Marcus's heart slammed in his chest. The sound of an engine revving echoed from behind them, and Marcus didn't have to look to know they were being chased. Whoever these people were, they didn't just want him. They wanted him dead. He could feel the pressure rising. No matter how fast they drove, their pursuers were gaining ground. The SUV hit another bump in the road, sending Marcus's mind spiraling back to his training. Stay calm. Stay focused. He reached down to his waist, feeling for the knife that had been his lifeline on countless operations. It was still there, hidden beneath his jacket. How much further? Marcus barked. "We're almost there," the man with the badge replied, his voice strained. "Just a little more." But the pursuing vehicle was closing in. They were too close now. Marcus's mind raced. What could they do to shake them off? A sudden thought sparked in his head. The road ahead splits. If they can't see us, they can't follow us. His hand gripped the handle of the door, and just as the SUV was about to take a sharp turn, he opened it. Without thinking, he jumped out, rolling across the snow and into the trees before the pursuing vehicle could catch up. The cold hit him like a shock of electricity as he scrambled to his feet, moving through the thick trees as silently as possible. His breathing was heavy, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The SUV was still visible, its headlights dancing through the snow. But he knew he couldn't let them see where he was. He moved through the forest, staying low to the ground, relying on every skill he had picked up during his years in the field. He could hear the sound of the pursuit vehicle growing louder, but he was staying just far enough out of view. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of snow underfoot, sent his heart racing. He had to stay ahead of them. Meanwhile, the SUV came to a screeching halt, its wheels sliding on the icy road. The man with the badge and the others scrambled out, their eyes frantically scanning the trees for any sign of Marcus. "He's gone," Agent Clark muttered. "We can't stay here." The man with the badge clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "We have no choice. We need him alive. Without him, this is over." They turned back toward the road, their focus now on their surroundings. But the game had changed. Marcus wasn't their captive anymore. He was their target. Marcus, hidden in the trees, could see the flashlights bobbing in the distance. The chase had begun again. But this time, it was on his terms. He kept moving, feeling the sting of the cold in his bones. He knew there was a risk in what he was doing, but he also knew that no one was going to find him unless he wanted them to. It was time to take control of this situation. Suddenly, he heard a noise to his left. His body tensed, his fingers gripping the knife. He crouched lower, waiting. The seconds felt like hours as he listened. The sound came closer. A shadow appeared through the trees. Someone was moving fast. Too fast. Marcus's instincts flared. It wasn't one of the armed men he had seen before. This figure was more agile, more dangerous. The next second, a flash of movement. Someone lunged at him from the shadows. Marcus reacted instantly, twisting to the side and driving his knife toward the figure. A grunt of pain echoed through the trees, and Marcus pulled back just in time to avoid a counterattack. But this wasn't just any ordinary fight. This was someone who knew how to fight like him. "Not bad," the stranger said, his voice cold. "But you'll need more than that to survive what's coming next." Marcus's eyes widened. The last thing he expected was to hear someone like him in the woods. But there was no time to process it. The fight was just beginning. The cold, sharp air cut through Marcus's skin as he stood face to face with the stranger in the trees. His pulse raced, but his mind was clear. He had trained for moments like this, where every second counted and every decision could mean life or death. The man in front of him was good. Too good. Marcus's knife was still in his hand, but he didn't dare make the first move. The stranger's eyes glinted with the same cold, calculated focus that Marcus had seen in countless enemies before. It was clear he wasn't just another soldier. This was someone who had spent years in the shadows, someone who knew the game better than most. "You know," the stranger said, his voice carrying the same edge of authority that Marcus himself had once wielded, "I thought you'd be harder to find. But here we are." Marcus took a step back, keeping his posture loose, but ready. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice firm but calm. He wasn't going to give away anything, not yet. The stranger's lips curled into a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're asking the wrong question, Bellamy. The question is, why are you still alive? After everything you've seen, after everything you've done, why aren't you dead already?" Marcus's brow furrowed. His mind raced, trying to place the man. "I could ask you the same thing. Who sent you?" The stranger chuckled darkly, his hands moving slowly to the sides of his jacket. "You don't need to know that. What you do need to know is that there's no escaping this. They won't let you leave, and neither will I." Suddenly, the air seemed to shift. The tension was thick, so thick that Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Without warning, the stranger lunged at him, moving with lightning speed. Marcus sidestepped just in time, and the stranger's fist slammed into the tree next to him. A loud crack echoed through the forest, but the stranger was already spinning, his foot coming toward Marcus in a swift arc. Marcus ducked under the kick, rolling to the side and springing back to his feet. His breath was ragged, but he couldn't afford to slow down. This fight wasn't just physical, it was a test of wills. And the man in front of him had already proven he was more than capable. "You're good," Marcus grunted, wiping a streak of blood from his lip. "But I've fought men like you before. The stranger narrowed his eyes. Maybe. But this is different. This isn't just a fight. This is about survival. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Survival. Was this stranger telling him that the odds were against him? That no matter how good he was, the forces chasing him would win in the end? But Marcus wasn't the type to back down. He wasn't going to give up without finding out just who these people were and, more importantly, why they were after him. Who sent you? Marcus repeated, his voice low and steady. What do you know about Black Lotus? The stranger seemed to hesitate for a moment before he lunged forward again. But this time, Marcus was ready. He sidestepped, grabbed the man's arm, and threw him to the ground with a swift move. The stranger didn't stay down long. He was up in an instant, fury burning in his eyes. You think you're the only one with answers, Bellamy? You think you're the only one who knows what's coming? Marcus wasn't sure if the man was bluffing, but he knew one thing. This fight was far from over. And if he didn't win it, he might not get another chance to learn the truth. The two circled each other, neither of them willing to make a mistake. Marcus could feel the weight of the fight. He knew it was a test of endurance, of grit. And despite how much this man might have known, Marcus had one thing he could rely on. He wasn't going to lose. Just then, the sound of a distant engine interrupted the standoff. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it was growing louder, faster. Both men paused for a moment, eyes flicking toward the source of the noise. They're here, the stranger said, his voice low and urgent. We don't have time to finish this. But don't think for a second that this is over, Bellamy. Marcus didn't have time to argue. He had to act fast. Before the stranger could make another move, Marcus bolted toward the trees, weaving through the thick underbrush. His heart was pounding in his chest as he ran, hearing the crackling of leaves underfoot and the distant sound of pursuit. His eyes darted between the trees, trying to find his way to safety, but the ground was uneven, and the darkness made every step a gamble. The sound of the engine grew louder, and then, suddenly, a flash of headlights appeared through the trees. They were here. Without thinking, Marcus dove to the ground, rolling behind a large boulder just as the vehicle sped past. His breath caught in his throat, but he held still, hoping that whoever was following him wouldn't notice his presence. He peered over the edge of the boulder, watching as the SUV came to a screeching halt just a few yards away. The doors flew open, and the men poured out, their guns drawn, their faces set with determination. Spread out, one of them shouted. He's close. Find him. Marcus held his breath. He could see the shadows of their figures moving through the trees, their flashlights darting back and forth. They were getting closer. Too close. But then, he saw it, an opening ahead, a gap in the trees. If he could make it there, he might be able to get away, maybe even circle back around and confront them. He wasn't sure how long he'd been running, minutes? Hours? The cold was numbing his limbs, but he pushed through it. He had one chance, and he was going to take it. With one last glance at the figures in the distance, Marcus made his move. He sprinted toward the gap, the sound of his feet pounding the snow-covered ground echoing in his ears. His muscles screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop. He had to get out. He had to survive. But just as he reached the clearing, a sharp pain exploded in his shoulder. The world around him spun as he stumbled forward, his vision blurring. He reached for the wound, his fingers slick with blood, but the force of the shot had already knocked the breath out of him. His legs gave way, and he fell to his knees, struggling to stay conscious. The last thing he heard before everything went black was a voice, cold, unfeeling, and all too familiar. You're not going anywhere, Bellamy.